Good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your busy day to have an interesting dialogue about what's been going on here this week. As Dr. Trees mentioned, I'm news director up at Alabama Public Radio, and but my wife still lives down here in Florida. We're selling our homes and we're moving up. So this week was supposed to be a combination of helping Lucia pack and going to the UCF Book Festival. And I thought it was going to be a nice, straightforward, easy week. Silly me. Well, there's a philosopher who said that if you don't know where you were, you don't know where you are. So for anybody who has not watched television, read newspapers, listened to the radio, here's sort of a thumbnail sketch of what's been going on over the past few months. When President Obama came up with his budget plan, he wanted to kill NASA's return to the moon, which is a big deal in Alabama because the Marshall Space Flight Center is creating the Orion capsule and the Ares rocket, but apparently not anymore. And also the notion of having private companies create rockets and capsules, first to resupply the International Space Station, but also possibly send up astronauts in a commercial rocket. Now, the end of the space shuttle program and the budget plan means probably 7,000 to 9,000 jobs lost out of Brevard County. And you might ask here in Central Florida, well, you know, this is Orlando, why do we care? Well, if someone lives over in Brevard County, but they work here in Orlando, obvious impact there. If somebody lives in Orlando but works over on the Space Coast, obvious impact there. But if you have people over in the Space Coast who are established, they have ties, their children have ties, and all of a sudden they're without employment, then where are they likely to go looking for jobs if there aren't jobs over in Brevard County, Central Florida? So that takes us to yesterday. Now, I had a signing last night, and everybody came running up and saying, what did Mr. Obama have to say at the Kennedy Space Center? And I had to think for a moment and said, well, not all that different, but he was so darn nice about it. It reminds me of a saying that my father used to have about, you know, the true mark of a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to blazes and you look forward to the trip. And that's kind of what is going on here with the White House. The president is sticking to his guns. The moon program, as far as he is concerned, is gone. The Orion crew capsule, which was being developed by the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville to go to the moon, will no longer be going to the moon. Now it will be a lifeboat for the International Space Station. So instead of exploring the lunar surface, it will be the lifeboat on the Titanic. He is pushing ahead the notion of commercial rockets, but also the possibility of a heavy lift launch vehicle similar to the Saturn V that put Americans on the surface of the moon. So I don't know. I'm an Air Force kid, and my family and I, we were up at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. I was 8 at the time. And then we moved down here in 1972, just in time for Apollo 14. So I'm a kid, you know, walking outside, watching Alan Shepard blast off for his trip to the Fra Maura Highlands. And I don't know, it seems that, all right, quick audience participation here. What is your earliest memory of the space program? Anybody? Got Sputnik from Dr. Swallow here. Anybody else? Anything else? Vanguard, one of the earlier rockets. That was back when the rockets blew up as much as they succeeded. There was one called the Navajo, and they nicknamed it the Never Go. Gentleman in the back. Challenger accident. That was my first shuttle assignment, actually. Yeah, so it's learning how to swim by jumping into 9 feet of water. Well, the big impact on the space program, we've heard it here, but in the 60s, you could also see it on television, because how many people remember, for example, I Dream of Jeannie? Okay, hands going up. Larry Hagman later went on to be JR in Dallas, but back in the 60s, he was an astronaut who landed on a desert island, found the bottle, opened the bottle, and there's Barbara Eden incurring the ire of network censors because she dared to bare her belly button on nationwide television. Horrors. But for Brevard County, well, if you remember, it was set in Cocoa Beach, and you would actually hear the people in the program saying, hey, why don't we go over to Bernard's Surf for dinner? There actually is a Bernard's Surf. It's called the Surf now, but it still operates. Now, how big of an impact was this for Brevard County? Well, if you go down on A1A, you will actually find I Dream of Jeannie Lane. which is one of those roads to nowhere. It just kind of leads out onto the beach, but there you go in terms of, the impact that space had at that time. Remember, I was a kid in the 60s, which means that, back then, and I'm sure a lot of people here were the same way, members of the Tang Dynasty. Now, back then, I mean, I was very astute for a kid. I told my folks, listen, you're going to get the jar of Tang. Make sure you get the one with the little plastic moon rover that is shrink wrapped on the outside of the jar. And woe be it to my folks, if they came home and they didn't have the little plastic moon buggy, because it's like their picture would be on a milk carton for sure, I'm telling you. But then comes the move down to Florida. Here's where the deja vu kicks in. Okay, back in 1971 when we arrived, there were two big names that were making headlines at that time. One, obviously, was Apollo. This is one of the most famous pictures that came out of the first walk on the moon. And the big irony is, and you can ask NASA about this, that there are no still photographs of Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. He held onto the camera. So every picture you see, whether it's an astronaut walking around or somebody coming down the lunar lander, it's always of Buzz. Except this picture, where you get really anal retentive spacophiles who will say, there is one picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Look at Buzz's faceplate. You see that little tiny humanoid figure right in the middle of the plate? That's the reflection of Neil Armstrong taking the picture. So for people who like to wear t-shirts that read, does anal retentive have a hyphen, there is one picture of Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. There you see it. There we go. Okay, now, I told you that there were two big names that were making news at the time that my family and I moved down here to Florida. Now, one was Apollo, and there's another one out there that I'm just trying to, it's on the tip of my tongue. Who's the leader of the club to made for you and me? Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Back when NASA celebrated its 50th anniversary, the Florida Historical Society asked me to write the intro to a Florida Historical Quarterly that talked about NASA's 50th anniversary. And being a kid of the early 70s here, it kind of struck me that whether you're talking NASA or you're talking Disney, here's where the sense of deja vu about jobs comes in, that really neither had Florida as the number one choice to move to. In fact, we weren't even on the list for a while. When NASA came up with the idea of trying to send people to the moon, they were talking about the possibility of launching it from California. They were talking the possibility of launching it from Texas. There was even some talk about even going to Bahamas. So the notion of Florida being NASA's back door to the stars has never always been the case with Disney. They were thinking of Niagara Falls. They were thinking of St. Louis. And only after finding out, what kind of a land deal they could make down here, they decided to come down, buy 27,000 acres, and they're down here in Central Florida. So, 1971, the Dugganses arrive, including a much younger version of me. Disney arrives, Apollo is in its height. When Neil Armstrong's little toe hits the moon, we have essentially fulfilled the promise of Project Apollo. At least that's the way it was sold to the American people, and that's the way that even NASA played along with it. We're going to beat those darn Russians. Fine. That whooshing sound is the 50,000 or so engineers who almost immediately lost their jobs following the first Apollo moon landing. And it was so bad at that time that some, and I write about this in my book, that some engineers could be working on a Saturn V rocket one day, and then as soon as these cuts make, heard horror stories of people literally going from up NASA to working at gas stations, to working in orange groves. It was that drastic. So here we are again with the situation that we're looking at here for Brevard County. It is not going to be pleasant for Brevard. It is not going to be pleasant for Central Florida. But, and you'll hear this no doubt from the panel discussion later on, that Brevard feels as though that they are better prepared this time around than they were back during the days of Apollo. But we'll see. So, a lot of people, Dr. Trees mentioned the comment about somebody saying, well, why don't we fly the shuttle to the moon? It's amazing how many people, even at this point, really do not know that NASA is making a rather large change. Now, people ask me, what do I like best, the launches or the landings? I always go with the landings, believe it or not, because when the shuttles blast off, it's very dramatic, and especially at night, if you saw the nighttime one the other day. But the astronauts, for the most part, are kind of sitting there with their hands in their laps, because unless there's an emergency, the shuttle pretty much flies itself. But when you come back, you've got one man or woman with their hand on the control stick for those final critical moments before the shuttle touches down. And I've been to, as Dr. Trees mentioned, 102 shuttle launches, about 50 or so landings. And the landings are always my favorite. The shuttle first appears as a black arrowhead over your head. Sometimes there are some wags who work in the press, and I've just heard of this. I've never done it myself, obviously. But they'll get into a group of people who look like they've never been to a shuttle landing before, way before the shuttle has entered Florida airspace, and they'll do this, just to see whether or not they can get everybody to start looking for the spacecraft that isn't there. So anyway, this is what's going away. For a time, this is what would be replacing it. That's the Orion crew capsule that the president has in his mind, his budgetary mind, to use as a lifeboat aboard the International Space Station. And then along comes this. How many of you have ever bid for anything on eBay? Of those of you who held up your hands, how many of you use PayPal? Meet the owner of this space capsule. Elon Musk, the gentleman who made his fortune on PayPal, selling people whatever, I mean, you know, Crimson Tide football tickets or T-shirts or whatever on eBay, took his money and created SpaceX. And they are in the process of getting ready to test a Falcon 9 rocket, completely commercial, to take up this space capsule, again, completely commercial, first just to carry up cargo to the International Space Station. But what do you know, right next to the hatch there, they installed a window, which means there are already some people talking about the possibility that if you put on a heat shield, a docking mechanism, and safety systems, there's the possibility of actually being able to put human beings up into space. How radical is this? Okay, how many of you got dragged to this back in the 1960s? 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, if you look really closely at this illustration, that was the Stanley Kubrick film that was written by Arthur C. Clarke, who, by the way, I interviewed for my new book, Trailblazing Mars. The space shuttle that you see there has a big logo on the side of it reading Pan Am. And once the main characters are inside the space station, you find out that it is run by Hilton, which, when you think about it, is pretty much what the president seems to have in mind. Let big business make money in low Earth orbit, and then, okay, well, we'll see what happens when everybody moves out farther into space, which would be the civilian space agency, whether it's the moon or asteroids or going on to Mars. So this era of change is what prompted me. For a long time, people always said, hey, you got to write a book, got to write a book, got to write a book. And I'm like, yeah, it's on my bucket list. I'll do it one of these days. The loss of Challenger, the loss of Columbia, was what got me going, because that, a year later, is when President Bush the younger, said, okay, we're going to get rid of the shuttle and we're going to move on to something else. Originally, he wanted Project Constellation, which may not survive. So that is where I started off with Final Countdown. When the shuttle was clear it was going to be going away, I'm not kidding here, getting back to Disney, NASA gathered all of the contractors that put them on the moon and went to the Contemporary Resort Hotel at Walt Disney World in 2005. That's where the little monorail train zipped through on your way to the Magic Kingdom. And they had the first space exploration conference. And they said, whatever design you can come up with, throw it at the wall and we'll make it stick. I had a friend who was an editor for Marvel Comics at one point in his career. Those people that do like Incredible Hulk and Iron Man. And he said he would go to cocktail parties all the time with his colleagues, and they'd be standing there with a drink, and an argument would start up. If the Incredible Hulk took on the Thing from the Fantastic Four, could he take him? Now, if you go and apply that to rocket scientists during this conference, you have pretty much an idea of what it is that NASA had in mind. And that's where I start off with Final Countdown. Now, when everybody says, oh my gosh, a book with engineers in it, oh man, is it going to be wonky? Is it going to be too technical? Well, when I think of engineers during this time of change, I think of Sam Bedingfield. Sam was the first Apollo engineer to get a phone call from the Kennedy Space Center, actually NASA brass, saying, Sam, we got something new for you to work on. And it's going to be something a little bit different. It's we don't know what it's going to be called, but it's going to be some kind of space shuttle. And so Sam goes off to work on this, but his career started much earlier. In fact, he flew jets at Edwards Air Force Base with a friend of his named Gus Grissom. And this is part of Chapter 3. Back in 1959, before NASA and Project Apollo, Bedingfield left the Air Force to pursue farming on land owned by his father in North Carolina. There was only one catch. After 3 days, says Bedingfield, I figured out I didn't give a damn about farming. With a wife and a family to provide for, he went back to the only thing that he knew, and that was aviation. Bedingfield's search for a job led him north to Langley Field in Virginia. The people in the employment office said they didn't have any aviation jobs available, but the news wasn't really all that bad. They said there was a new outfit called NASA on the other side of the runway, and they needed people, so why not try there? Bedingfield drove around to the NASA office, walked inside, and there, behind the desk, sat Gus Grissom. What are you doing here? The fledgling astronaut asked. Bedingfield said he was looking for a job, but they didn't have any. Well, we got jobs here, Grissom said. Bedingfield admitted he didn't know the first thing about launching rockets. That's okay, Grissom replied. Neither does NASA. So that's where the book begins. And anybody who knows me knows that my brain is this never-ending font of trivia, which I may have demonstrated already up to this point. But everybody knows that it was John F. Kennedy who challenged America to put a man on the moon. But it was Richard Nixon who welcomed the astronauts back. And you may or may not know that the Contemporary Resort Hotel back in the early 1970s, in response to a question from a newspaper editor, is the first time that Nixon ever used the phrase, "I am not a crook." I love stuff like that. So anyway, moving on to every reporter who covers anything, and I've done 102 missions, you have to start someplace. And for me, that was the Challenger accident back in 1986. Back then, nobody was covering the shuttle at all. I was doing another story at that time. One of my colleagues runs past the window saying, "The shuttle blew up," and I'm like, right, I went back to the story that I was working on for just a second anyway. And then I figured, well, there may be something to this. So a tenth of a second later, I'm in the next production room over. That's the Orlando Public Station, and where they're recording the launch video or launch commentary from the Challenger liftoff with Krista McAuliffe. And I'd never seen a more pasty-faced group of people in my entire life. And it was at that point that I grabbed a set of news car keys, grabbed a recorder, and I followed the mushroom cloud out to the Kennedy Space Center. By the time I got there, the debris was still landing. And this is part of the, what you're seeing here is part of the nose cone from the underside of the crew cabin. In fact, I was talking to the NTSB, and the fact that this piece of wreckage was not twisted out of shape was the closest the NTSB would say to confirm that probably the crew cabin was still on the inside of that piece of fuselage, which prevented from being bent up when it hit the water at a terminal velocity of about 120 miles an hour. And oddly enough, that trained me very well for 2003. Out at the Kennedy Space Center, waiting for the Columbia to come back, and of course I'm waiting for the two sonic booms, which never occurred. So I stopped writing my first post-landing spot for NPR, sought out the first NASA manager I could find, and said, "Well, what happened?" And they looked at me and said, "Well, we've lost an orbiter." And that started me on 3 hours, unscripted, live on Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. A little bit later on, Mike Leinbach, who's the launch director at Kennedy Space Center, was in charge of gathering all of the Columbia accident debris. And one time he brought about like 12 of us into the hangar where they had assembled this. This picture is of the leading edge of the left wing. They gathered all of the heat shields and they loaded it into this plastic frame that you're seeing here. And that's where they were trying to recreate exactly what happened to the vehicle. So Mike's like, "Okay, no news here, nothing happening. Just ask any questions, and we'll try and get you the answers." And he said, "Oh, by the way, here, and let's see if this laser printer actually works. Okay, just point to this area right here." He said, "You see that hole right there?" And I was the only one standing there. He said, "Yeah." He said, "See that hole there about the size of a football?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, we theorize that's where a piece of the foam came off the external fuel tank 1 minute after liftoff, struck the wing, caused the damage, and destroyed the shuttle and killed the crew." And I'm like, "I've never heard this before. When did you guys come up with this?" He said, "Oh, about an hour ago." To which I'm like, "Will you pardon me for just 1 second here?" Out comes the cell phone. We start talking on National Public Radio. So anyway, covering the shuttle all this time, you really get a feel for the people who work there, the people who are probably about to be hurt by what's going to be going on with the budget, irregardless of what Mr. Obama does. The shuttle program is going away. And you get a feel for exactly how dedicated they are, how much this means to them, how much they wear the space program on their sleeve. True story. And grizzled old engineers love to tell this one. Back during Project Mercury, they were launching on Atlas rockets, and they got water building up in the fuel lines of the vehicle, and the rocket engines wouldn't work right. So NASA's like, "Well, you got to do something about this." So they thought, well, why don't we come up with a chemical formula to disperse the water? It's a water dispersion formula. And they tried 39 different combinations of chemicals to try and get the water droplets out, and it didn't work out. And it was the 40th of these formulas that actually did work. And NASA always liked to come up with acronyms, so instead of water dispersion, they called it WD. So, I mean, how many of you at home have taken care of a squeaky doorknob or a stuck hinge or something like that with WD-40? Now, I'm not suggesting that we send people to Mars just, to fix squeaky hinges and doorknobs, but again, you just never know where benefits from the space program come out. So the future, Mr. Obama seems to think there's a future, and following the writing of Final Countdown, I'm also wrapping up the next one that I'm working on right now, which will be out in September, and that is Trailblazing Mars, NASA's Next Giant Leap. And we'll see how it goes. The interviews, including Alan Shepard, Arthur C. Clarke, Carl Sagan. If we do wind up doing that, how much will commercial industry play into it? How much will international companies or international rocket makers play into that? We don't know. It's way down the road. A lot of speculation here. For example, even the right stuff may change. I mean, I spoke to a psychologist who says that right now, astronauts that NASA select are the best of the best of the best type A people. They're like Superman. And yet, this psychologist opines maybe Clark Kent would be a better idea, because it's like 6 months there to Mars, depending on how you go, a year on the planet, and then a year back. So, you know, having somebody who's a little bit more mild-mannered might be a sharp way to go. Truth be told, they had a survey at the Johnson Space Flight Center in Huntsville, in Texas, and they asked the astronauts, who do you think would be the most important person to go on a trip to Mars? And they listed all of the names, and they had like pilot, commander, geologist, ship's doctor. Who do you think won? Anybody? Ship's doctor. Got to vote for ship's doctor. Okay. Anybody else? Geologist over here. Okay. I was being a bit tricky here. There is one name that I left out of my list, and that was the mechanic. And the mechanic won, hands down, because halfway to Mars, something happens with your spacecraft. What do you think Houston's going to do? Oh, well, we'll send the AAA for you. It's okay, you know. Leave the hood up on your spaceship so they'll know that it's you, okay? So actually, Mr. Scott from Star Trek won out of all of this. You know, I don't have the power. So that's the person that all the astronauts want to be with them as they venture off into Mars. So a lot of question marks that have been still left regarding what the president may do, most specifically what Congress may do, because actually I think that is where the next big fight is going to be, because you've got people such as Richard Shelby in Alabama, probably still feeling pretty burned by what had happened, Bill Nelson here in Florida, and then America's still in the midst of an economic downturn, and NASA has this nasty habit of looking big because we've got rockets and astronauts floating up their drinking tank, so it's a likely target during the budgetary process. We'll just have to wait and see. So with that, Dr. Trees, turn the podium back to you.
I'm going to start our panel discussion today by asking each of our distinguished panel members to take just a couple minutes and to answer the following questions. While Diane did a great job with introductions, I'd like each of you to explain the role of your organization in relation to the space industry. So I think we'll start right here with you, Mr. Workman.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. I said I'm Representative Rich Workman. I represent a large portion of Brevard County. When I was elected in 2008, I realized that there's a misconception in Florida. The misconception for the last 50 years was that space was a Brevard County issue. In other words, when I was up there looking for dollars for a workforce or dollars for Innovation Park or some kind of assistance for Brevard County in its space program, I was finding myself competing with a road in Duval County or a bridge in Lafayette. And I thought, well, wait a minute. We're not talking apples to apples. We have a space program that affects 67 counties out of 67. We all should be engaged in this. We should all care about space, and it shouldn't compete against local projects as if it was a Space Coast issue. So immediately upon my election, I founded the Space Caucus. For those who don't know, a caucus is when a group of legislators get together on a common cause. I took it because NASA loves patches. We made patches. You probably won't want to get one of those. Over half the House and Senate have joined the Space Caucus, realizing that there are direct jobs that link in their county to Brevard County and the Space Coast. And as a result, this year we have an incredible amount of dollars and initiatives that are coming towards Brevard, the good work of Representative Steve Christofoli, John Tobias, Senator Mike Herodopoulos, Thad Altman, Debbie Mayfield have brought dollars back. But when I say to Brevard, it's almost not fair, because I'll tell you that NASA is much bigger than Brevard County. So we'll talk more about the dollars coming back home as a result of a declining workforce. But it's really because for the first time in Florida history, space is a Florida issue, not a Space Coast issue. And that was a pretty huge change as a result of the ending of the space shuttle.
Linda.
Well, thank you. I'll be just a little bit specific in what we do. An economic development agency is to basically enhance the economic base by relocating companies tied to particular industry, because you show your competitive advantage. In this case, it would be space, or working with the expansion of local industry. And it's as profound as it is simple in the explanation of it. So our role regarding this is to first try to mitigate the gap by offsetting those job losses by expansion of local industry. Working within, and I know we're talking a lot about NASA, we also remember that space is more than NASA in the state of Florida. There's a lot of companies tied to that, ground support equipment, satellite manufacturers that we have in Brevard County through Harris Corporation, and other opportunities too. So while our focus and discussion today will focus on NASA, let's keep in mind too that we're far more diversified than we were in the Apollo days, not only within the state of Florida's industry base, but also within our historical space base too. That space industry is far more diversified than it was. There was a chapter 2, as opposed to Apollo when it was just a closed book. So our job is to work with what companies that are there that we can negotiate with, leveraging our competitive advantage, making the argument, and it's severely competitive. You can imagine this day and age what communities would do to bring jobs all over the nation. We're in the deepest, longest recession we've had in the last 100 years. So basically that's what it is. And you do that by a variety of ways, but I think the number one key in being successful, what sets good EDC apart from an average EDC, is the people at this table. You better know what your assets are. We don't have the authority of certain programs, but we have the responsibility of closing the deal. So we work with people like Rich Workman, who's done something that's never been done before by putting together a Space Caucus. The expertise at the state of Florida, university linkage that the research is required, and workforce boards and training.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. MJ.
Well, what Diane didn't mention was my most important job is that I teach school at UCF, and I've been staring into space and taking up space since I was in the 4th grade. I'm probably the only geek up at the panel here, you know, so I can actually write the formula for the escape velocity if you want to know what it takes to get to the moon, you know, and that sort of stuff. Details. I know none of the politicians care about that sort of stuff. But anyway, just like, you know, you need to have one mechanic on that spaceship, you need to have one geek on the panel. I'm it. And in addition to that, in terms of the Space Coast and the space effort, I sit on Linda's board, so enjoy working with the leadership in Brevard County and trying to develop the economy there, particularly the value-added, wealth-producing economy of Brevard County and our whole region, as it relates to space and as it relates to other areas of science and technology as well. Part of my responsibility at UCF is for what's called the Florida Space Institute, which we are revitalizing, and we even in these tight budget times, we've devoted $1.5 million to that effort, and we're recruiting a new leader for that activity. We've got a great pool of candidates, including some of the top scientists in the country that have developed and flown space missions for NASA and so forth, and that's enough.
Trust me, he could go on. He spared us all. But we will hear more later. Lisa?
Thank you. Brevard Workforce Board is actually responsible for all of the talent side of this equation. And so when we look at this situation, we have to look at how can we partner with our economic development folks, how can we partner with the universities to make sure that we've got the educational training that needs to happen for these people, as well as to make sure that we're able to use this talent as a recruiting tool to bring other businesses here or to help a business even expand. So I always say that if it deals with anything touching workforce, we're involved. And I've had people say, well, okay, then that just means you're there for when they need to be trained to go into a job. The reality is that we're there every step of the way, looking at what are those companies that are coming so that we have a forecasting of the skills that are going to be needed and can actually get that out to people, out to our educational system and out to the workers as fast as possible. It's a huge job we have before us, but we're excited and thrilled and also very thrilled to be a part of this team because it is a team effort that we see going on, not just in Brevard, but across this region as well.
Thank you, Lacey. Pat?
As a journalist, the way I look at this is that everybody, I think the question on everybody's lips right now is what's next. And as far as Mr. Obama, he has said his piece. And now the real part of the fight, in my opinion, is going to be coming up in the fall. That's when Congress really starts to beat up on the budget. And that's where we're going to see the actual rollout of everything that's going to happen here. And I can only point out, and I'm sure you all know this, that White Houses have made promises regarding space as far back as we can all remember. I mean, everybody here can do their worst John F. Kennedy imitation when he talks about the 1962 speech at Rice University. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they're easy, but because they're hot, and you have to use the hot. All right. What most people don't know is that 2 weeks prior, he took that exact same rhetoric before a joint session of Congress and not only talked about the moon, but talked about a nuclear-based rocket that will go beyond the moon. And the people at the Johnson Space Center, that represented Mars, even back then. We're still here. We've gone to the moon, last time 72, and that's as far as we've gotten. George Bush the elder, the first President Bush, said, let's go to Mars. Congress said, no money. Bush the younger said, let's go to Mars. No money. Here we are again. So until Washington's checkbook comes out, a compelling argument can be made that really we're not going any farther, despite all the rhetoric. So I think that's kind of the next small step to borrow from Neil Armstrong.
Frank?
Also, a legislatively chartered public corporation, but with very, very broad powers, especially financing authority. We are unlike any other agency in the state with respect to the breadth of the tools and the capabilities that we have available to us. The third characteristic of the entity is that we are also a special purpose district, which means I have municipal powers and I can float bonds and do things that many other agencies cannot. Fundamentally, we're responsible for ensuring that the state has a strategic plan for growth of the aerospace industry in the state and measure that in terms of jobs and economic well-being back to the citizens of the state. And we have put such a strategic plan in place, but we're also responsible for the execution of that plan across a broad array of talents. Today, that is done not just with our own team, but largely in collaboration and partnership with the workforce organizations, the economic development organizations in the state, working with the industry and the universities, and especially with our legislature as a real team to get those things accomplished. I'll try to cut it off there. There's a lot we can talk about, but look forward to Q&A.
Great.
With the workforce organizations, the economic development organizations in the state, working with the industry and the universities, and especially with our legislature as a real team to get those things accomplished. I'll try to cut it off there. There's a lot we can talk about, but look forward to Q&A.
In light of the President's remarks yesterday, can you explain what was clarified in the presidential policy set forth earlier this year regarding NASA and the space industry?
Well, I think that just the fact that the president bent as much as he did indicates that he's aware that there's going to be blowback from Congress. In other words, for the most part, members of the House and Senate have, up to this point, have given the president a legislative version of the raspberry as far as his budget is concerned. They don't like it. Now, one of the problems for NASA is that nothing happens in the space program within an election cycle. So it's very difficult for a member of Congress to be able to put their stamp on something happening with NASA, like putting their name on a bridge. You simply can't do that, which to one degree or another almost made Apollo a bit of a fluke, because you had President Kennedy said, let's go to the moon, and then the nation tragically lost that young, vibrant president, and a very compelling argument can be made that that's what eliminated a lot of the political kibitzing that might have kept Apollo from going through, because doggone it, we've got to go the distance for JFK. We've got to get an astronaut on the surface of the moon, and then after Neil Armstrong landed, well, that's kind of it. So, in terms of getting a change in the mindset of Washington and not treating the space program just as a jobs program, I think is going to be one of the big challenges. I mean, for everybody over in Brevard County who's living with the uncertainty of what's going to happen, it's a terrible time for them. It really is. But to just think of NASA just as a jobs program, I think maybe kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of causing problems for the space agency. So we'll just have to see how it goes. Again, down in the fall, that's when Congress will start working on their version of the budget. The president proposes, they dispose, and that's when we're really gonna, that's when the rubber will really hit the road.
Great. Pat, thank you. Great answer. And speaking of jobs, Linda Weatherman, how have you been preparing for the economic ramifications and the search for the procurement of new diversifying industry with the end of the shuttle program imminent?
Well, it's a big question, and I'm going to try to give a short answer, and there's two parts to it, but I'm not going to get into the bigger issue of diversifying the whole of the economy. That's traditional economic development. We relocated Embraer, their third largest aviation company in the world, their first North American manufacturing plant. We got it. That mitigated the job loss because they're certainly interested in a lot of those people that will be coming out of the shuttle program. We've got these people that are trained 3 generations deep, and you can't really buy that. You can't create it. A brochure can't create that. That's something that happens over time, and you're lucky. So that's an example of mitigating. Now that's starting at 200 jobs, so that leaves us 6,800 left, I guess, to try to fulfill. So the other thing is, I think the more relevant and germane to the discussion today is looking at the program that we have now. And I'm going to go back to an example, because I'm very proud of it, and as a state we should be proud of it, because it pushed a paradigm shift of the historical, cultural legacy of the economic base that we had in Florida. But what programs are going to come out, and which ones can we exploit? Because in economic development, all you can do is exploit the handsets that you're dealt. And if we decide to have a commercial approach, fine. If it's going to be Aries, fine. We just need to know what and part of the challenges that we have is since the Augustine report, no one's making a decision. You bet a company's not going to make a decision. Relocate, they don't know what's going to go on. Now we've got Obama's budget. Now we got Congress. We're ready to say, okay, what is it? Is it going to be Aries? I can't afford to care. It's not my role to care. My role is to exploit and get Philistine in operations. The example I can give you, and it's something we need to look back, is the first opportunity that came out of the Constellation budget was the Orion. That's why it was critical when Obama retained the Orion. And we as a state came out and said, you know what, let's have the Orion built there. We've never in 50 years in the state of Florida have had assembly work, okay? We're a notch operation. So that's one of those things, you say it easy, but to make it happen is hard. And gosh darn it, we were successful. And it was a team effort. So we pushed a paradigm shift. For the first time in 50 years of history in the state of Florida regarding space, we brought assembly work. So the first time we had it out of the box, we were successful. So we just need to emulate that again. So we're just ready for the program. So basically, it's studying the programs, being smart, having people like Lisa and Frank DeBell and MJ really much more smarter and understanding this program and saying, which one of these programs can we capture? And don't let the fact that we didn't have them before not capture. Orion, we could build upon that. That's the thin edge of the wedge. There's supply chain tied to it. We just need to know what the programs are. That's where we're struggling now.
Specifically, talking about assembly workers, I guess, and Lisa Rice, we've known about the shuttle retirement projection since 2004. How has your organization been preparing for this economic transition?
Well, contrary to the popular belief that we've just been sitting back eating bonbons for the last few years, we have been extremely active with this workforce situation. About 3 years ago, the Brevard Workforce Board brought together a group of stakeholders, and I'll tell you that stakeholder list has now grown. We're up to around 55, 60 members that are involved in the Aerospace Career Development Council. And that includes industry people, both private sector and public sector, NASA folks, as well as the contractors, that means. We have Space Florida involved, Enterprise Florida involved, the universities are involved, economic development is involved, and what this group did is sat down and said 3 years ago, here's what we need to be focusing on. And it was focusing on getting the assistance immediately to start retraining workers. It was also focused on don't move them out of their jobs right now because we need them to safely launch all of the shuttles. So we've been working now for those years in training, and thanks to the legislature for the last 2 years, and Rich Workman had a lot to do with this, we've been able to get funding from the state. We had 1.5 million the first year and 1.85 million we're dealing with this year, and right now, everybody cross your fingers, there's 3.2 million in the budget for the coming year. All of that is geared towards making the aerospace workers aware of us, aware of what we're doing, reaching out to them, helping them decide what they're going to be when they grow up. Looking at their resumes, you wouldn't believe how hard it is to write a resume if you haven't written one for 20 years, or if all you know is acronyms and you don't know how to put that into what you're really doing. I've looked at some of these resumes and I'm like, I don't understand what the ABC of the XYZ means when I'm a business person trying to hire you. So we work on that. We've worked on interviewing skills with them, and we have a wonderful partnership with NASA because we've had our first Space Act agreement, first one I have ever heard of with a workforce board with NASA, where they've opened up offices for us right in their headquarters building, free of charge. They have now their transitional office right next door to us. We share on staffing and we share on responsibilities. They're helping us conduct some of our workshops. They've done an excellent job with their How Do You Get a Job in the Federal Market workshop that goes through how do you apply, how do you interview. The feedback we've received from that is incredible. We've got people who have told us, I know it's because I went to these 2 workshops that I got this federal job. It's exciting things that we're seeing come through. The problem that we see is that it's coming through in little tiny amounts. We need it to come through in large amounts. The last couple of months, I'll give you an idea here. Before January, we were getting about 200 people a month to register with us. And they have to register with us so we can know who they are, track them, see what we've done with them. In the month of January, we had 1,200 people register with us. In the month of February, over 1,600 people register with us. So obviously the word got out and people got a little bit scared. Now, interesting piece that happened is that in the month of March, it dropped back down to 400 people registering with us. We believe that that was kind of in the time frame of everybody hearing that President Obama was going to come and he was going to say something. And we think everybody just kind of went, oh, wait, I'll wait and see what he says. Maybe there's hope. Maybe the shuttle's going to keep on flying. So now we're very interested and we're watching our numbers to see if there's an uptick again. Now that, his budget, he's explained a little bit more. We have a little bit more understanding of where we're going. I would say as well, the other side that we've been working on is at the federal level. There are possibilities for us to bring down national level, federal level funds to help with this entire transition. And that's actually a part of what that $40 million that was announced from President Obama is about. It's economic development combined with workforce development, which is the best way to do it because then we know that we're putting people to jobs, not just training them for something that maybe doesn't result in a job. So we've been extremely active. I didn't even touch on all the regional activities that we've done over here that you've been a part of, sir, but a lot of the same kinds of things happening regionally.
And Lisa, thank you so much for your great leadership in this area. There's about 60,000 plus people impacted, about 6,600 just in Orange County. So, we don't talk about it as much here because it's seen so much as being just in Brevard, but we know it's statewide with 60,000 plus workers, which leads us, Frank, to the big job that you have, and thank you so much for your leadership. Your budget dropped about $7 million in 2007 to $3.8 million this year, and that's unfortunate. But since taking over Space Florida last September, you've made some great changes, I think, canceling or phasing out the early $3 million worth of projects and contracts, reduced staff and external lobbying firm as well. Number 3, abandoned efforts to build a $60 million launch pad that had no customers committed to using it. So you say we have to diversify the state's industry and sources of funding. That a lot of space-related technologies share much wider applications that we need to go after these. So can you elaborate and give some specific examples of some things that you have in mind?
Sure. I think it's important that before we get into the markets, the job of the agency is really to face the market, just like a business, and to win projects for the state in the market, and then to convert those to economic activity for the well-being of the people in the state. But we needed to get our own house in order first. And the agency had always had a difficulty identifying its mission. There was some identity crisis as to whether it was a spaceport authority or an economic development organization. So we concentrated on putting out a vision for the aerospace industry in the state and set some target goals for the growth of the aerospace industry in the state over the next decade by 3 times, as measured in terms of jobs and economic activity. We're going to achieve that 3 times growth through a strategy of diversification of the industry well beyond its core capabilities, and I'll elaborate on what they are, and also through vertical integration in the supply chain in each of those 10 market sectors that we've identified. The 10 market sectors cover Florida's core strengths in launch and in the things that ride up at the pointy end of the rocket, satellites and all kinds of other payloads, as well as all of the ground support equipment that makes all of that infrastructure useful in some kind of science or exploration or other kind of economic activity, and there are a whole array of those. The other 7 market sectors apply to people who use space in some way to make money or to benefit mankind. So it's agriculture and food production, where we have the capability to use hyperspectral images and other kinds of images from space to do precision farming, or to enhance plant growth, or to do a variety of other things that affect the quality of food that we produce, and that's especially true for Florida. There is climate and weather monitoring, and there are a whole array of applications of space technology to that industry. Florida has an established industry in that area. There's communications, cybersecurity, and robotics that go together. And robotics will be a significant part of our space future, whether we're talking about NASA's civil program or the defense applications of space, but also true in many of the commercial applications of space. Even a spacecraft, in an exploration sense, is a robotic companion when you're going along. Your habitat is a robotic companion. The people or the machines that we send out to do gathering of science or gathering of material, they are robotic companions. So clearly the future will have a lot of robotics and advanced software, and that plays to a lot of Florida's traditional strengths. We're talking about one of those segments being adventure tourism, which takes advantage of the fact that Florida has a broad tourism industry, and we're very active in trying to attract many of the next generation reusable and personal spaceflight companies, from Virgin Galactic to Explore to many of the others, who all desire to operate out of Florida, and we're engaged with every one of those. There is a nexus of clean energy applications where space technology advances typically along the edges, and especially the edges where it touches other areas. Clean energy is one of those. And we are actively working to bring a lot of new clean energy projects to the state in hydrogen, in advanced alternative fuels, in photovoltaics, in a variety of applications where many of the Space Center skills and the workforce that we're talking about, their culture and their skill set apply directly to these clean energy projects. The other area that I'll mention, and I'll close with that, is the whole bio-life sciences area. Now that the station is completing the assembly of the nation's $100 billion investment in the International Space Station, that facility is available to the world as a research laboratory. It's a very robust, almost £1 million on orbit of lab and living space. And the U.S. portion is half of it. The U.S. has some rights to use some of the international half, but in the U.S. portion, half of the U.S. portion has been designated as an international laboratory. And we intend to actively pursue Florida as a ground node for that international lab or federal national lab. That means we're reaching out aggressively to pharmaceutical companies, materials companies, aerospace companies, people like 3M or Dow Corning, the chemical companies, but we're doing that globally. And we're also reaching to sovereign nations that desire to have a space program, but may not have the wherewithal to actively engage in their own budgets. So Florida-based assets, Florida workforce, and the ability to go back and forth to the station and use our surrounding university network and our surrounding research and laboratories and kinds of complexes that exist, as an example here in Lake Nona, are all assets that we want to pull together to have Florida serve as a ground node for the ISS. There are others as well, but I'll cut it off there.
Wonderful. MJ, all kinds of educators, colleges, science institutions, and other government agencies will be using the ISS for research. How does this new direction play into a university such as University of Central Florida?
Okay, first let me apologize from talking from my notes. As Ray said, that I can go on and I can go off the reservation, so they always script me with things like this. And my colleague, Dr. Dan Holzenbeck, has all that white hair, and that's because of me saying things when politicians are present that usually cause him great angst. So I'll try to stay on the reservation and on time. UCF has ongoing right now some specific research areas, very talented young faculty doing research in such topics as microgravity, the clumping of dust and particles in microgravity. I mean, only a geek can get excited about that, but if you're interested in how the solar system forms, how the planet forms, this is what you do. Obviously, we've got interest in doing those experiments and with sounding rockets as well as on the International Space Station. I think there are great opportunities there. We have a lot of programs at UCF and other universities in the state system that have to do with remote sensing. And what a better platform than an International Space Station. And I understand they just put a window in the thing, so now you can actually look out at the Earth and do a lot of experiments in Earth sensing, and also in free space laser communications, another very strong area of research at UCF. So we're prepared to write proposals, to compete for funds, to do experiments there as soon as the RFP request for proposals come out. And let me just add on to what Mr. DeBella was saying. Shame on us if we don't put together a proposal to make Florida the manager of this new national lab called the International Space Station. Now, we might lose that competition to Johns Hopkins. We might lose that competition to JPL, but shame on us if we don't step up, get to work, prepare a proposal, and really try to wrestle that for our state, and we can do it. As somebody said before, I think Linda, we have a different situation than at the end of Apollo. We've got a lot of tech-based companies here in the state of Florida, particularly along the I-4 corridor, which somebody said yesterday should be the nation's space corridor. We should get ready and get to work and compete and win the management of that new national lab here in Florida.
Governor Chris called for new legislation to ensure the state's continued leadership in spaceflight and exploration. A number of ideas have been set forth, among them setting up an investment fund for aerospace and asking for about $3.2 million in retraining money for KSC workers. What legislation has actually been proposed, and then what is the current outlook?
Sure, and I'll touch on a few things that my colleague spoke about. And 3.2 million has already been touched on. That is in the budget in the House and the Senate and the governor's budget. Governor's been a little loose with the veto pen, so we need is to remind him continually that space is, a Florida issue, and make sure that survives. Somebody mentioned that we've known about this for a long time. I think it might have been one of your talking points. I don't think anyone really believed, though, that we would actually shut down human spaceflight to wait for the next human spaceflight. I don't think anyone would expect GM to stop building a car, research the design for a new car before they fire up the assembly line on the next phase of the car. So politicians, business people are set aback that we're going to follow in the footsteps of Apollo and just send the workforce away. And unlike the years of Apollo, these are not retirement age folks, at least not all of them. They're going to go find space jobs somewhere else. And thank God we have Lisa and Linda to try to keep these workforce folks, or this workforce in Florida, because this time, instead of going to the citrus yards and the gas stations, they're going to India, China, Japan, and anywhere else they can go to continue to fly rockets and human beings into space. It is a travesty that America sets its international dominance in space aside for any amount of time, certainly years, that puts us at a disadvantage unparalleled in my generation. So you asked about, Representative Christopher has a STAR program. It's about $30 million for space related activities. It gives Space Florida a lot of room to work. The concept in saving space in Florida is to use NASA as the staple. It's the reason that we have a space program, but we are not here to support a federal program. We are here to use that as the staple and then expand our commercial operations in Florida, of which every one of these folks have talked about. And let me give you an idea how the state does that. First, let me tell you that I don't believe government creates jobs. I believe that government can invest capital to attract jobs. And that's what these panelists work on a daily basis. So in the past, Space Florida and the state of Florida invested tens of millions of dollars, 20-something million, to build a launch pad that SpaceX will eventually launch their rockets from. That's a job builder, that's an industry builder. We redesigned the OIC, which is where Linda talked about the Orion space capsule is going to be built from. That was another $20 million or so. And then we built Innovation Park years ago that we're going to reinvest in and attract more jobs, which, by the way, MJ, if Frank has his way and if the legislature gets their wish, which is in the budget, which, cross your fingers, we keep it through the process, when we connect Innovation Park to, or the Life Science Center to the public, see right now that building sits behind the NASA gate. For about $7 million, we're going to extend around the NASA gate, connect to the public, where now people that are not badged for KSC can actually come and work on projects and experiments that will be on the space station. That's a dream of DeBello's, and now apparently yours too, that we can be the hub for the International Space Station, because that is one spot, thank goodness, we are far ahead of the other 49 states. I can't say that with commercial launch, I can't say that with other human spaceflight initiatives, but I can say that we're ahead on that, and this legislature is not going to let that go. So I'll tell you, and my next question deals with it too, we have a lot of legislation, and in a very, 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 very tough budget year, there is about $40 million worth of cash and incentives in the budget for space, probably more than any other aspect of the budget is space. And so we'll talk with this Dawes Center thing.
Can university and academic research be more closely aligned with industry, first, and then to accelerate opportunities such as the space industry? So the question is, will the university see any of these dollars?
Is the Pope Catholic?
All right.
UCS particularly is very interested in doing partnerships with industry and with government entities. We secure about 40% of our sponsored research in partnership with industry, and most of that partnership is within the high-tech corridor. So this is a venue that we're accustomed to playing in, and we're very aggressive about. We put $2 million a year of our own money on the table to incentivize faculty to work with industry, and we've done over 1,000 projects with industry over the last 10 years as part of the high-tech corridor. So the answer is absolutely yes. If you look at the infrastructure along the high-tech corridor of the universities that reside here, we have 3 of the 10 largest universities in the country. The University of Central Florida being the 3rd largest, and then followed by the University of Florida, and then University of South Florida. Plus we have Florida Tech, and Embry-Riddle University, all with interest, all with very talented faculty and students that are working on technologies that are critical to the next phase of our space program. It could be new materials, it could be new propellants, it could be new structures, as well as the design of new missions to be flown. I remember a meeting sort of like the one yesterday when Administrator Golden came down to Florida, and we beat him all up because we didn't get our share of NASA funds here in Florida. And his response was more or less, well, you don't have enough buckets to put it in. What he was saying, we hadn't developed the intellectual infrastructure that we needed in order to really compete for the top end programs that NASA had. I think we've gone a long way since then in our university system. We compete every day and win these programs. We at UCF had a project called Gold that was a satellite that designed here, set to fly, favorably reviewed, recommended for funding, and then dropped because Constellation program overruns took all the money. So we're ready to compete in all aspects of technology, and further to help Florida move into, shall we say, higher up the food chain to the pointy end of the rocket, and compete nationally. And I don't care whether we're behind or ahead of people. Heck, we at UCF have been behind everybody except the IEEE Spectrum did a review of patent strengths of universities, and UCF came out third in the nation, and the only two people ahead of us was the University of Texas system and the University of California system. So, hey, we're accustomed to being behind, but we're ready to compete. We've got some great ideas. We're working on this problem of who the guy should go to Mars. Should it be Clark Kent or Superman? We have our largest program now from NASA at UCF is a human factors program that's addressing that very issue of how do you get people to work together as teams for long periods of time in close confinement. It's one of the areas that we have developed expertise in due to our work with the Defense Department. And this whole idea of human robotic interaction is another strength that we have at the university and in Florida. The Institute for Human Machine Space Cognition over in Pensacola, that's their strength as well. And finally, I'd say we've done a lot of great work on autonomous vehicles, and starting behind the oldest vehicle in the competition, the smallest budget by a factor of 2, older by a factor of 10, and smaller by a factor of 10 in the budget as well. And we ended up in 7th place in that competition nationally. So we're ready to go, and if once the Congress and the leadership decides what direction we are going to go, and we're ready to compete and to work with industry to secure Florida's place in the space industry, not only with having the top spaceport in the world, but also being the place where the missions that sit on the pointy end are designed and built in addition to loaded and shot up to space with the rockets.
Great. Thank you, MJ.
Would you mind if I added something
Sure.
to this? Because MJ's being modest over here, too. I have to tell you a little quick story about how they've worked with us with industry, and it's resulting in jobs. And what we had is Lockheed Martin, the defense area, come to us and say that they were interested in modeling and simulation. So we said, great, let's get all the players in the room. University of Central Florida was one of the players because they have a program that's along the lines of modeling and simulation. Well, Lockheed said, we like your curriculum, but we need some changes. There was no pushback. There was no, no, you don't know what you're talking about. We got to do it our way, which I've seen with other academic entities. Not these guys. They went, absolutely, we got it, it's yours. We'll do it, we'll make the change. They've made the change. Now Lockheed Martin has said once the people take the course and graduate from it, they are then considered as internal candidates for the jobs that Lockheed Martin has in modeling and simulation. That's huge. That's huge to listen to industry like that and make changes like that. So kudos to my alma mater.
Yeah, kudos. We agree with you. How do we as a state secure the other aspects you mentioned? Won't we be competing with the other space facility locations across the country who are guarding their own specialties and intellectual capacity?
Well, let me just address that. Yes, we are competing, but that's the nature of business, and we have a lot to work with to compete with. I think that we plan to invest heavily, time, energy, and smart movement. I think we want to be strategic and tactical, investing in a lot of the key drivers for growth. MJ talked about one of them, which is clearly all the research and technology capabilities that we have in the state And Florida, I believe, in spite of the successes that we've talked about, has never had a level of research and development activity that's sponsored by federal or even corporate work that we should have. So there's a large room for improvement in that area, and we're going to be working aggressively with our university partners to try to improve that. There are opportunities in the president's budget for the civil agency, NASA, but we're looking well beyond just, if you look at the marketplace, let me back up. There's clearly all the defense marketplace. There's the civil agency marketplace, which goes way beyond NASA. It includes NOAA, Department of Energy, NIH, and a whole lot of other agencies, all of whom have an interest in space. And then there's the entire commercial marketplace, both domestic and abroad. And we want to be able to capture business and bring it here from all of those markets. That means facing the markets, being responsive to market need, and presenting our best resources. So we're going to be investing to move smarter, to showcase the resources and to work in collaboration to do that. Linda mentioned looking for the opportunities that are out there. If you look at the president's budget, and we think about long-term and near-term, long-term, we think we've got the right diversification strategy for the growth of the state, and in all of those market areas that I mentioned. But there are some real opportunities in the president's budget that are going to take some heavy lifting to capture. They involve some of the capabilities, though, that we're all very strong in. The autonomous rendezvous and docking area that NASA will be investing in. We think Florida has a lot of strengths to bring to bear, and we're going to be looking to capture some role here for the Florida workforce. Florida has always been channeled toward operations and launch. We want to broaden that now to a lot of R&D activity. Closed-loop environmental support systems. As we go out beyond low Earth orbit, we need to keep astronauts alive. We need to carry the food and fuel necessary. We need to protect them in their path. We need to have the propulsion technology and other systems to support an integrated whole as you go beyond low Earth orbit. A lot of those capabilities exist in Florida's biotech community, in the universities right now, and in many of the environmental support activities that we've already got going on in the state. There is a significant capability that the administration plans to invest in what I call on-orbit refueling and fuel transfer, which may mean that when we do go up into space for low Earth orbit, we don't have to do it with one very, very large booster. We can do it with a number of smaller launch vehicles and then assemble things on orbit or refuel up there. It's a concept that changes the paradigm for space transportation. When you think about it, an on-orbit refueling station is nothing more than a spaceport in the sky. And Florida knows more about operating a spaceport than any other state, or for that matter, nation. And I think that we probably have the most skill set at handling cryogenics and the fuels that will be up there. So we look for a Florida role in that budget that strengthens our R&D base across the civil agencies. And I suggest that same thing is true when we start to take a look at near-term program opportunities in Department of Energy or in NOAA's plans for space or in the Department of Agriculture and NIH who are looking to do research on the International Space Station. We have a wide array of R&D activities to go after. But that same thing is true when we look at other areas beyond R&D. The commercial business activity that the administration plans to open up by turning over low Earth orbit transportation to commercial companies, that represents a real opportunity for us because they will want to launch out of Florida, and that means there's an opportunity to capture the final assembly and integration of the spacecraft that they'll all be flying, whether it's for cargo or for crew, as well as doing a lot of the supply chain activity in support of that final assembly and integration function. So there's a series of potential business growth areas that really make sense for Florida and what we'll be focused on.
Linda, we've heard much about the negative aspects of the president's plan. How has it positively impacted the Space Coast EDC, and what changes are evident after the president's remarks yesterday?
Well, first of all, it's probably one of the few agencies that got a $6 billion plus up. I think Frank referenced that earlier. So that means more programs, more opportunities, more contracts to be let. So not that we would be able to get all of it. So that's the positive part of it. And again, please understand my philosophy is whatever comes out, we have to exploit. But in regards to the commercial-driven aspects, we already have a bit of our presence with them. SpaceX is one of the premier ones you look at. We've been talking to SpaceX for 6 years. They're looking to launch here. They have an establishment here. What we want to get now is what was referenced earlier, is that whole food chain and bring the assembly work here, and eventually maybe the manufacturing work here. That will happen when that market is developed, and that's what happens to a lot of companies, whether it's photovoltaic companies or launch operations. They want to go where the market is or where their customers are. So it's not like commercial's new to us. Also remember, please, you probably know this already, commercial part was always part of the plan. Whether you're talking about the Constellation plan, there was always a part of it. So part of our responding to our strategy, our capture strategy, was also to look at commercial. So it's not new to us. SpaceX, the biggest one that we want to look at too, again, is Orbital Sciences. Talk about them. They've made some investment in Virginia. It's early days. What is our competitive advantage to get them? I guess the best way is to look at it is, if we as a state as a nation, want to push commercial, which, by the way, Rich, I'd like to talk to you one day over this. Isn't it interesting that we're pushing, and this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but we're pushing commercial.
Excuse us for a moment.
Yeah. We're pushing, here's a Democratic president pushing a commercial-driven endeavor that's been inherently a Republican argument. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, irony, I was driving this morning thinking about it. So my point is that we need to be able to look at all those. So if we as a state say, look, we want to go to put cargo in space and we want it to be driven by commercial, that could be United Launch Alliance, that could be SpaceX, that could be Boeing. It's the usual suspects too, not just a company that's just a startup company too. We identify them. If we're serious about putting man in space with these commercial, there's about 4 or 5 players. You need to make sure that you interface with all of those and start developing the programs in-house. SpaceX, Orbital Science, United Launch Alliance. What is it that you need that this state and this local community can deliver in the next 2 years, 5 years, 6 years to make you have more attraction here and bring jobs here? So again, the thing is, whether it's commercial or areas, my personal insight, it doesn't matter, but the key is that we need to determine quickly and effectively what do we want as a space policy, because until we do, can we finalize our capture plans the same way we did it with the Constellation program.
Great answer. Thank you. Pat Duggins, considering the possible switch to commercial rocket makers, how will that change the way you all, journalists, cover the space program?
Oh, a little bit. True story. I was doing a story one time. It was not on a manned space flight. I believe it was Boeing was assembling one of their ELVs, one of their expendable launch vehicles that don't carry people, and the rocket was on its side in a large silo over the Cape. And I was interviewing one of the chief launch managers about something. It was several years ago, and it was about that time that we were very interested in getting stuff for our website. So our web person gave me a digital camera and said that if I don't come back with some shots of me interviewing this guy, my picture will wind up on a milk carton, or I'll be sentenced to life in front of a firing squad or something like that. So I'm there with the person I'm interviewing and his handler, and I turned to the handler and said, would you mind taking a picture of the two of us while we're talking, just for the website? And the manager that I was talking to, his eyes kind of got like this, and he said, well, can we kind of move over here just a little bit? And I'm kind of like, yeah, sure, whatever. And then later he explained that where we were standing, the shot would have been directly into the engine compartment of this privately owned rocket, chock full of trade secrets that they do not want their competitors to know about. You saw the slide that I had up earlier of the Dragon capsule that's being built by SpaceX. Orbital is one of the other companies that has a NASA contract to develop its own kind of cargo capsule for the International Space Station. And just as, Macy's and Gimbals did not necessarily get along very well, you can bet your boots that SpaceX and Orbital would certainly prefer to keep whatever they come up with from the other side. That's not only going to impact launch rockets, but the way we start using the International Space Station, I think, is going to be a shock to the journalistic community and the American people, because a lot of the experiments that are going to be done on the International Space Station as part of this national lab program are going to be trade secrets of certain companies. So, I mean, instead of having astronauts, floating around saying, well, this is what I'm doing today, and this is what I'm doing today during a press conference, they're going to put on dark glasses and a phony beard and sneak off to some part of the space station to do this work for XYZ Corporation. And I think it's going to be the new world, but I think it's going to be jarring not only for people who report on the space program, but also the American people whose tax dollars actually put all of this stuff together. So I think it's going to be a big change.
Frank, who would like to
take it first, or?
Well, I think all of us could probably speak to it because we're very focused on it. But we know that there's a baseline of roughly 9,000 people who are working on the shuttle outside of NASA. I'm talking about in the contractor community. And we've broken that down. We understand the composition of that workforce, where they are, what kinds of skill sets that they have. And that is the database that Lisa's been working with and that Linda has been working with, and simply looking at it from different aspects. But the program that the President mentioned takes into account that there are roughly half of that workforce that is likely to be taken up into the new programs. And that leaves roughly 4,500 on the other side, some percentage of which are likely to retire. And that's because over 30% of the workforce today is close to retirement age. Now, I have to tell you, in this economy, not very many people are going to retire, and we understand that. So we think that there's a rough impacted number of about half that workforce, which means that we've got to reach to areas outside of the space industry to try to retrain and apply that workforce to those areas. The problem is and has always been the gap, not just in spaceflight, but in work application. And that's as big a problem for us. It's the reason that we have a consistent complaint about the gap, and why Rich Workman made the comments that he did about ceasing to fly shuttle, which is the only vehicle that we have available to fill some of that gap and keep some of that workforce supplied. So we're actively looking at everything we can do for the half of the workforce that we know will be affected. And there are many, many areas of application in clean energy, in other areas of manufacturing, in high-speed rail, that we can, and in fact, in building the 21st century spaceport, that we can move those workers to. The other half, though, it's not all roses there either, because the shuttle program will come to an end, which means a fall off in the workforce. No new program starts up the very next day. There is a ramp-up time. So clearly, we're going to go through a valley, and it's up to all of us working in partnership to fill that valley as much as we can with work content. And I can tell you that the administration and NASA, OSTP, and the Office of Management and Budget are all actively looking at ways to place work assignments to fill some of that gap. They do care about what's happening. I think they want to be able to declare success in Florida and Texas and other areas that are affected. This is not just a Florida problem.
May I add to that? I'm going to just stand up because I know my voter back there couldn't see me, so I want to make sure. Rich has a T in it. There doesn't have to be a valley. This is the part that's driving me insane. I'd mentioned GM stopping and then
It's okay. They're just cleaning sidewalk.
waiting a few years to start it back up. You need to thank Senator Lemieux in D.C., Congressman Posey, and Congresswoman Cosmos. They have bills that will extend the shuttle. We all know that after the last shuttle goes, there's one sitting on the pad ready to go. She's done. That's one launch. There's two more external tanks in near completion at a closed-down subcontractor. We spend money on star-rated appliances and cash for clunkers, but we can't spend 1/8% of the federal budget to extend a shuttle program that is safer now than ever. And instead, we're going to put the workers, our astronauts, onto a Russian rocket that is less successful than our space shuttle rocket in a percentage mind. So what my plea to you is do not accept that there has to be a lull, but instead shift your focus to Congress and remind them that they control the budget, not the President of the United States, and that they need to put the money in the budget to at least fly out the 3 remaining shuttles that are in some form of construction. Do them 2 a year. Keep in mind, we're trying to run out 5 shuttles in 1 year. We haven't done that, correct me if I'm wrong, since before Challenger. Have we launched 5 shuttles in 1 year? I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. That's amazing. What is the rush to fire a bunch of people? What is the rush? We do 2 a year. That's at least a 3-year extension. And during that time, we get SpaceX launching. We get the next generation heavy lift vehicle in some form. There doesn't have to be a lull, and don't accept that. For the students here, for the business leaders here, don't accept there has to be a lull, and turn your attention to Congress and demand that they fund the space shuttle while we continue to explore the next heavy lift. That's my plea. I know that's Congressman Posey. I know that's Senator Lemieux's plan. Go help them convince Congress that it's not a Republican issue to fly the space shuttle, but it's a bipartisan issue. That space is national security, and you know the talking points. But we have to continue to fly that shuttle while we continue all these great things. We're America. We can do that. As odd as it may seem. Thank you.
I would add to that just real quickly, the 2,500 that he's talked about coming in the next 2 years, I'm still trying to grasp how he gets to that, because when I look at this from the knowledge that we have, keeping the Orion capsule part will be 500 jobs to start with, ramp up to 1,000. So let's just give it 1,000, okay? That's 1,500 other jobs that I'm not quite clear where they come from in 2 years' time. If we're talking about the infrastructure and the construction that has to happen, which will be jobs, those are not the same jobs that aerospace workers will transfer to. There are maybe a few that are in the maintenance and are in the facility kind of work that would qualify to go into that, but that's a very small number that we're talking about. So most of that 1,500, if remember, that is associated with the construction of the infrastructure, that's going to come from the outside in. That's not bad, it's still jobs, but it's just not the same thing as replacing one for one. So that's a concern that I have. And then I totally agree. The steps that the president has taken so far, they're great steps forward, but there's another piece to lay on top of it, which is to allow the shuttle to do a few flights a year. You're still going to have a reduced workforce. You'd still be down to probably only about 40% of the total workforce would be needed to fly just a couple of shuttles a year. So you still have a reduction in cost, and you still have people laid off that we do need to move into emerging industries.
Understand what this community is rallying about, not just Florida, but the nation? Is there any way to get a copy of that?
There is, and I'll tell you, there's an ongoing active effort. It's the lady Lee Holt. Everybody knows Lee because I get her emails, and she is relentless. So as things change, but please.
If I can make a comment too, sir, that a lot of what you've heard today has been reflected in op-eds that I've written, that Frank has written, Lisa's written. We wrote a letter directly to the president from our chairman, reflecting, addressing, closing the gap, making a decision on what we want as a future space so we can move on. There's also a letter sent to the president, co-signed by Associated Industries of Florida, AFL-CIO, President Frank DeBello, myself, again, outlining this a little bit more detail. So there has been a program of getting the words out. Not germane to a lot of the questions that were answered today. Well, actually, yes, because a lot of those questions were the same thing. The gap, what are we going to do? What do we need, and how do we get there?
Also, on a state level, sir, you can go to spacecaucus.com, and you'll see every bill, ones that are not going forward, the ones that are going forward, where exactly they are in the process, and how much money they relate to. Spacecaucus.com is a good resource for the state.
And also, I understand that our colleagues from UCF Media Relations are also going to take this entire production and put it on YouTube.
Right.
I'll make
So you just want somebody to-
one other comment just to add to what's been said. I think the administration had always planned on providing more detail about their budget as time went on, because there is, and it is a budget that's going to be debated on Capitol Hill. But the shape of what they've been releasing is largely the result of listening to the rhetoric and the concerns and the angst that's in the community, not just here in Florida, although they're paying a lot of attention to Florida. And we've been delivering that message collectively that there are real concerns either with the gap or with the impact on the workforce or with the shape of the program or the lack of definition and clarity about the goals of the work in the budget. But they're also listening to Texas and Alabama and Mississippi, and we've been working in close collaboration with those other states to carry that message in Washington and to a broader legislative delegation that is just our own. So count on the fact that we're working to deliver that message in a very real way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Let's give this panel a great round of applause.